When we left off with our heroes last week, they were in a pretty bad situation, right? They had just returned from Moab, gotten back to Bethlehem, and Ruth and Naomi had nothing. And one day, Ruth says to Naomi, "Let me go down to the fields and collect the leftovers so that we don't die." It's the first century equivalent of heading down to the office and getting on SNAP, the food stamps program. Because in the Israelite law, this was something that people were supposed to do. In Deuteronomy, it says, when you are harvesting in your field and you overlook a sheaf, don't go back to get it. Leave it for the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. When you beat the olives from your trees, do not go over the branches a second time. Leave what remains for the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow. When you harvest the grapes in your vineyard, do not go over the vines again. Leave what remains for the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt. This is why I command you to do this. The system is built so that the poor in Israel have a way to provide food. So that there's a way for people who cannot work, especially people who are widows or orphans, to be able to gather food. Trusting the inefficiency of people to leave stuff behind. And Ruth, being poor, a widow, and a foreigner, is going to go take advantage of this system. So she goes out and just so happens to end up in a field owned by a guy named Boaz, someone who is a relative of Naomi's late husband. So Ruth goes and works in the field for a while, and then Boaz comes to the field and he greets his workers, and then he looks out and says, "Whose young woman is that?" Now that sounds like a very weird thing to say, especially to us. We don't usually see someone and say, "Who do they belong to?" But in that culture, if a young woman, Ruth was probably 25-ish at this point in the story, for her to be out in the field working means that something went wrong. So Boaz is asking, who messed up that this young woman is in the field? How did the system fail so that this young woman has to go and gather the scraps in the field? Or even there might be a touch of, what father or husband is such a terrible father or husband that this young woman has to do this? He's offended. He's offended at Ruth having to gather grain for herself. And so he asks around and finds out that it's Ruth, the daughter-in-law of Naomi, who came back with her from Moab. All of a sudden, Boaz does a bunch of weird stuff. So first he goes to Ruth and says, "Don't go anywhere else. Just work in my fields. I'll make sure no one harasses or attacks you. If you're thirsty, go grab some water. If you're hungry, grab some food. If you need shelter, grab some shelter. Just stay here. I'll take care of you." Ruth is astounded by this because that's weird. But for Boaz, Ruth is family. See, that's a thing that often gets missed because we've turned the story of Ruth and Boaz into a love story, and it wasn't really written that way. Because back then, it gets kind of awkward, but for everything that Boaz does for Ruth is what he is supposed to do as a kinsman redeemer or a guardian redeemer. Because as soon as Boaz finds out that Ruth is family, this is just what he's supposed to do, to take care of family, to make sure that family is protected, to make sure that family has food. So when lunchtime comes around, it's no big deal for Boaz to invite Ruth to come and eat lunch with them, to give her so much food that she has enough to take home to Naomi. And then when Ruth has gone back to the field, he tells all of his workers to be extra sloppy. Leave a little bit more for her. Make sure she's taken care of. They do such a good job of doing a bad job that Ruth goes home with 30 pounds of barley. Can you imagine? Like, a 5-pound bag of flour is hard to negotiate, and she's coming home with 30 pounds of barley. So it's no surprise that when Ruth gets home and Naomi sees all this food that she's got, Naomi is just dumbstruck. Where did you work? How did you get all this food? What are we going to do with all this food? And so Ruth, like a rather typical 25-year-old girl at this point, starts telling Naomi all about what happened with her day. And this guy who just decided to start doing stuff for her. And as soon as Naomi finds out that it's Boaz, Naomi's surprise goes completely away. Because Boaz is the Redeemer. Now, this is an interesting concept with a pretty wide range of responsibilities. The kinsman redeemer or guardian redeemer, or in Hebrew it's Goel, the redeemer is the one that's supposed to fix family problems. It's kind of like a family version of the enforcer in hockey. I mean, a little bit. Where, he's the one that's supposed to protect and look out for the rest of the family. If, for example, a relative is in a bad situation and has to sell themselves into slavery because they're so poor, it's the Redeemer's job to buy them back. If they have to sell property because they're poor, it's the Redeemer's job to buy that property back. If someone in the family is murdered, it's the Redeemer's job to avenge that murder. And if the Redeemer is a brother, it's their job to marry the deceased in that whole levirate marriage thing that married the deceased's wife in that levirate marriage thing that got super confusing and awkward and doesn't get any less confusing and awkward. Also, if a relative dies because of an incident, the Redeemer is the one who is supposed to receive the restitution from that. And there's even an order of priority of like who is supposed to serve as the Redeemer. It starts at a brother, then it's an uncle, then it's a cousin, and then it kind of just goes out from there as to whoever the closest relative is. Boaz is close enough on this priority list that Naomi recognizes that he is doing his job as a Redeemer. And Naomi gets a little bit excited by this because if Boaz is doing this much and letting Ruth come home with 30 pounds of barley, maybe there's more that Boaz might be willing to do. So Naomi starts to hatch a plan that will come to fruition at the end of the barley harvest, and for us, we'll read about next week. But this idea of the Redeemer is one that becomes very important to the Israelite people because it starts to be applied in more situations than just these little family situations. It starts to be applied in a broader sense as well. In the book of Isaiah, the title of Redeemer starts to get applied to God. Isaiah looks forward to a time when God will redeem Israel from their captivity in Babylon and restore their land and their identity. In the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, this happens, and God does restore Israel to themselves. But Ruth adds an interesting twist in that at the end of the book of Ruth, we find out that the Messiah will be this Redeemer to the people. Ruth does this by, at the end of the book, drawing a connection between Ruth and David. Ruth, of course, ends up, Sorry to spoil the book of Ruth for you here. Ruth is going to be David's great-grandmother. I'm sorry, I know none of you ever knew that, but I just wanted to make it clear. And of course, from whose line is the Messiah going to come? David's. Now, it's interesting, if you look at ancient Jewish commentaries about the book of Ruth, they say that from Ruth's line will come 6 great men. And while, there's anybody's guess who the other 4 are, they all agree on 2 of them. One of them is David, and the other is the Messiah. And so when we look back on the book of Ruth and we see these actions that Boaz is taking as a redeemer, we can see in what Boaz is doing a preview of what Jesus does, the one who is our ultimate redeemer. Not just from the earthly problems of poverty or hunger, although especially in Luke's gospel, that is a big part of it. But Jesus redeems us from the problems that have plagued humanity for as long as humanity has been, the problem of sin and death. Jesus redeems us from the stuff that has been a problem since humanity was kicked out of the garden. The care that Boaz shows to Ruth is a preview of the care and love that Jesus shows to us. And when Boaz ultimately redeems Ruth and Naomi, it reflects the redemption that Jesus gives us, where Jesus will redeem us from sin on the cross and redeems us from death by rising from the grave. And that is one of the fun things about this concept of the Redeemer that we see in Ruth. Because as we look at what Boaz does, we can see who Jesus is. And we can see through Boaz the ways that Jesus takes care of us. And we can be reminded of our own redemption that Jesus bought through the cross and the empty tomb.